I hope that the psychology department at LAU knows how lucky they are to have you. So thanks so much for this, for creating this space, basically. So what I'll talk about today is, as Christelle mentioned, I'm going to be using Beirut By Dyke as a case study to be talking about my own experience in healing from trauma through the feminist praxis of comics creation. And my hope in doing that is to invite everyone, you as viewers, artists, content creators, but also mental health specialists to be thinking about this practice and embed it within the socioeconomic context in which it is experienced. So yesterday marked the 4-month anniversary of the Beirut explosion. So when I did hear about the Beirut explosion on August 4, 2020, I was safe in Groningen in the Netherlands. And I, like many others, started getting this surge of videos and of media depictions of the explosion. And I watched video after video after video because something in me very much needed to reconstruct this event and understand its parameters, understand where exactly it had happened, and from what angle, and what exactly was this scale. A week later, I published this comic to represent what I felt was a very weird experience, which I have never had. And it says, I stayed up all night having flashbacks of an explosion I did not witness. So what was happening was my body had not experienced trauma per se, right? It had not been present in the context of this humanitarian disaster. At the same time, it was very much experiencing the physical symptoms of trauma. That is flashbacks, insomnia, night terrors, and sensory stimulation, right? Overstimulation of the senses, actually. And I felt very alone in this experience because my automatic reaction was also to disinvalidate whatever pain I was feeling, thinking back then that I should not be feeling this pain because so many others were actually experiencing pain to a much bigger scale, right? So when I did publish this comic, I had 0 words to really access my emotions. I only had visual representations of what I felt were embodied experiences. I had no clue that it would be shared about 3,000 times. And when it was shared so many times and people started messaging me, telling me about their experiences of trauma transnationally, that in itself was a super validating experience for me, right? So usually as a reaction to trauma, what clinicians might call resilient reaction to trauma, those include reaching out to your community, reaching out to some kind of a social support network, right? I didn't feel like I have that. And that is not usually how I do react to trauma also, right? But through comics that were shared on a social media platform like Instagram, I was able to connect with a lot of strangers, right, as this online community that was also having this experience, which went from being super personal to being an experience that was actually shared. So I think that today in Lebanon, in terms of mental health, we are experiencing a very, very unique, unprecedented situation, right? Like if the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated conditions of massive precarity globally and invited new questions around mental health and physical confinement and the vulnerability of the body itself, in Lebanon, it only exacerbated conditions that were already hurting us physically and mentally, right? So today, our therapists in Lebanon are just as traumatized as the clients, right? They too are experiencing a sense of loss. They are shifting from, practicing in the context of a clinic with colleagues to practicing at home in their own private spaces using digital technologies, which presents its own challenges. So I drew this comic expressing, new challenges that, this sector was now experiencing, right? I feel terrified of your own trauma after the explosion, I'm telling my therapist. And perhaps we'll continue this discussion at the in the end, when I do reflect on what does it mean today to practice care in a context of chronic crisis and chronic oppression. So the way in which we experience trauma biologically differs across individuals, across events, right? I would imagine that most of you here are psychology students, so you probably already know this, but might be useful to remember that biologically, trauma affects us in all sorts of ways, right? So changes the functions of the limbic system, it overactivates the autonomic nervous system. We're constantly in this fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? It even creates some structural changes within the brain, particularly when it comes to areas like the hippocampus that are responsible for the functions, cognitive functions like memory, right? And another thing that trauma does also is create some problems when it comes to sensory integration for some people, right? And this is something that I personally have experienced. I have a very difficult time connecting or identifying internal cues. So this is what we call Enteroception, right? So recognizing or awareness of internal states and sensations, things like hunger cues, things like emotions, right? So what I do in this comic is represent the difficulty for me to engage in what we might call body-based ways of healing from trauma. So I represent here, once, this is a scene where I once went to a yoga session here in the Netherlands. And when I get there, I'm waiting for the tea to boil. The yoga instructor likes to give us some tea. And he asks me how I'm doing. And I answer, I say something like, I'm complaining about the flu, which is very usual in our culture, right? To just complain about things, and rightfully so. But the reaction that I got was something that I did not expect at the time. And he gave me a comment about, how ineffective complaining is and about the importance of gratitude. And I drew this comic as a reaction or a reflection on that moment itself. So let me just read to you what I wrote here. How do I explain to someone who has had a life so distant from my own that everything about where I come from and what I have been through plummeted the threshold of normality to levels which he cannot begin to comprehend? How do I explain that my being here today, on time for class, was itself a personal success I would high-five myself over? How do I explain that if I complain about the flu, it is because I am not complaining about the invisible trail of sweat and blood I left on my way here and at the airport and on a mattress in Beirut that I no longer own? How do I explain that in my culture we carry trauma in our spines like we would not know who we are without it? That his ability to walk with a straight back comes from the privilege he soaked in before birth? I can't explain. This is small talk after all, and class starts in 10 minutes. I smile instead, take the cup of tea, and wait in my corner, with thoughts spilling over the other mats in the room. How dare I disturb the feng shui of this space with the negativity imprinted on my parts? Let me focus instead on the ambient bamboo music and hope that it takes me somewhere over the privilege of here and now. So my hope in creating this comic, along with this the caption as a textual reference, right, was to hint at the invisibility of trauma, which a lot of us carry within our bodies, quite literally and metaphorically, across time, right? So trauma, especially for people in Lebanon, is no longer this one event or multiple event, and it has even surpassed chronic trauma, right? So this is what I mean by he as a person is soaking in the privilege. I'm hinting here at the I'm hinting here at neurotransmitters and stress hormones that we have actually soaked in before birth from a generation, from a war generation that has lived through stress and that has left and has biological trace in our own bodies, right? Being able to express this in comic form is very empowering, right? So it's allowing me to represent visually this out-of-body experience that I constantly feel when I am trying to heal from trauma, right? So if you look at the composition, I put me as a character that's in the corner. It's very far from you as viewer, as a way of also showing this distance that I constantly feel when it comes to my own psyche plus body, right? So there is this dissociation that I can show very well visually. I can also show through the body language of the character how they're also feeling out of place, right? All these other characters are in the moment, their eyes are closed, whereas mine are quite open and they're very cynical in fact, right? And very closed off as a way of, protecting the gut, which is very much a reaction to threat, whether or not it actually exists in the environment. So this was one way for me to empower myself and represent those sensorial experiences, but also textually then embed them in the socioeconomic context in which they were initially experienced, right? So if you zoom out of this, out of the body of, me as an artist, but also as a human or a citizen, right? If you zoom out of that body and think about how is it that we navigate spaces in Lebanon, and this is what I'll be talking about in my paper at UPenn, right? How is it that we navigate those spaces? You'll realize then that we are constantly, whether or not we realize it, constantly negotiating things around corporeal threat, right? And of course, this is especially true for anyone who challenges or who is actually marginalized by the heteropatriarchal system that governs us. So if you think about the roads in Lebanon, the urban fabric, the legal fabric, the political fabric that is surrounding us, everything causes an interruption. Everything causes a potential threat, right? You have the roadblocks, the traffic jams, the sounds of honking all the time, the smell of garbage, everything around us is creating this sensorial experience that is actually quite hostile when it comes to women, queer, and trans folks, and basically anyone who challenges the gender binary, then things become even more complicated. So in this comic, I'm representing, this very simple act of walking down the street to find some mental space, but also to transport my own body from point A to point B. I have to constantly listen to things like, bint wala thabi, are you man or woman? And so representing this in comic form is a way for me to actually denormalize it, because in coming to the Netherlands, I also realized how much, or to what extent, right, we normalize these violent encounters and thinking, okay, yeah, sure, I woke up at 7 a.m., true story. Went, to drive to work and I found a soldier masturbating in public. But I have to continue my day and go to work as if nothing happened. And I actually don't talk about it with colleagues or friends because it is just part of yet another day, right? So these things that we tend to normalize are things that we should not normalize because they are not normal and because they do reflect state failure to protect all sorts of bodies at the intersection of abstractions like race and gender, etc. So representing them in comic form gives me what I think is a very empowering way of doing that. So this is what happens when we go outside, right? We're constantly navigating threat. But then if you also think about it, what happens when we are in private spaces like families or homes? These spaces, especially for folks who challenge the gender binary and who are marginalized, lack the safety and privacy that they ought to have, right? So if you think about those folks, then you'll realize that often they grew up in environments and families that reject them, right? And this, and this is what I'm representing here in this comic, right? ضرورة سمينا بنسويتك, like in English, must you always make a feminist point? And this is also, visualizing the recognitions I made in reading people like Sarah Ahmad, for example, right? So what I'm doing here is inviting you as a viewer to stand in my shoes as a queer person, right? Where you often feel when you're around the family dinner table that it's a space that is closed off, right? So you see the character who's quite young is closing off the space, and you don't have access to a family circle that ought to usually provide your first social network, right? A first place in which you do find support. When it comes to queer and trans folks in Lebanon, unfortunately, it is these environments that are very rejecting, and they shape many of our upcoming experiences. They shape many of our understandings of the world, right? So we know very well in psychology, I mean, that these are your formative years, right? And if you are rejected by caregivers and siblings, and that first space is actually hostile, this very much shapes your interpersonal styles later on and the schemas you have about the world. Then what about those other professional spaces, right? So we go outside, it's a threat. Inside our family houses, it's not welcoming, it's very heteronormative. And the same goes for more professional private settings, like confessional boxes in religious settings, or gynecologist's office, or therapist's office. These spaces, which also ought to give us as humans, right, safety and privacy, for queer and trans folks in Lebanon often turn into very hostile environments, right? And we know this looking at stories from Beirut By Dyke, for example. We know this also. I've done a lot of polls on Beirut By Dyke about this, and we have heard horror stories about breach of confidentiality, about the way in which that queer clients are often threatened or harassed, or in fact, not given the proper care because of a lack of knowledge around queer practices. So when I was 15, I went to my first therapist. I was having mental health issues. And I went to this therapist who treated me for 3 years. And that therapist, unbeknownst to me, right, gave me what I can only today call as a form of conversion therapy. So she taught me for 3 years how to basically perform femininity, how to dress, how to talk to my peers, etc. 2 years ago, I'd made this comic about it. So let me just read that. So in the safe space, I will teach you how to perform your gender normally. Happiness comes from fitting in. As your therapist, I will reject your identity as you understand and express it today, because it clashes with my personal values and those of society. In the upcoming 10 years, you will lose trust in yourself, people, and the world, but will look very stunning in the skirt. So what I'm doing here is using what I think is deadpan humor, right? To kind of regain some control over the situation and use it to denounce, those types of practices that are, obviously very unethical, but that unfortunately still exist today in Lebanon, in spaces that ought to be very, very safe, right? And that provide unconditional positive regard for all sorts of clients, right? The funny thing about this comic is that in drawing it, I access some insights that I would never have that I would actually never have, right? So what happened is I drew this character, and it took me a while, but then I realized that something was off, and I realized that I drew myself as an adult. So I drew the body of an adult, right, as that first character that you saw. Now, what this meant is that I was actually cognitively revisiting that memory with the knowledge and skills that I have today. And I brought this comic into my current therapy. I was fortunate to find, an amazing therapist today. It's not the same, right? So I brought this comic into therapy, and we kind of analyzed it together, right? And through the use of self-portraiture, I accessed information about my own memories and my own insights and my own emotions, because I realized that the reason why I was drawing myself as an adult is because I was actually thinking of myself. I was actually kind of blaming my past self for not knowing better. But I forgot that this was a 15-year-old, right, in that therapy setting, that had no clue what conversion therapy was. She was in high school, right, going through all sorts of processes of her own. And what I needed back then is the safe space, right? And instead, what it did was recreate the very traumatic space and the very traumatic experiences that I did experience before coming into that therapy, right? So as a result, right, after this therapy session where I reflected on my own comic as a way of healing from trauma, I drew this comic. With the help of my therapist, I realized that I was judging my past self with my current psychological insight, which in a way was also disempowering the young adult within myself. So that was also me kind of punishing myself through that. But then in drawing this comic again was another way of owning again this narrative through insight, right? So self-portraiture is a wonderful way, usually that is used in art therapy, usually with the guide of a therapist, right? That gives you prompts and instructions and stuff depending on what your needs are. So doing it freestyle as I went also was a way for me to re-experience those milestones, if you want, right? And so what happens then is that there's a succession to that experience as a story, but that's also a way to represent the succession of my own healing process in public with others who also identified with the same struggles, which rendered it into this collective, very healing for me at least, right? Act of self-portraiture and reflection. So when I'm thinking about these things and representing them on Beirut by Dyke, I'm always making this conscious effort to remember to zoom out, right? So if we are thinking about trauma, we, I think, must go outside of, individual level factors and thinking about comorbidity and substance use and abuse, which is usually what we find in literature within the social sciences on LGBTQ individuals in Lebanon, right? So I think it's very important that we move beyond that by looking at the political context within which abuse happens, right? Within which trauma is experienced within the body. So in this comic, I represent one of the ways in which our state inflicted violence on us, right? So this is when the Chilean team came 3 weeks following the Beirut explosion and identified what was thought to be a heartbeat under the rubble. So it said, in my country, the government kills people twice. So here, through the use of comics, I'm giving a face to that heartbeat, right? I'm kind of bringing back this humanity to really the disaster that happened. And so, yeah, like the military violence, right? So I'm representing even the bodies of the soldiers as kind of, being the same and really physically, quite literally presenting a barrier to safety. Of course, as you all know, the heartbeat wasn't there. It turns out that there was no one under that rubble, but it's what represents about this process, right? So the state has, for those of you who don't know, just in case, the state had issued the decision to find a crane the next morning during work hours, because when the Chilean team did identify the heartbeat, it was too late. So this, again, demonstrated the extent to which a failed state, right, or consciously failed state, can literally physically cause damage to its own citizens. So I also wrote this poem about how people are reacting to it, right, after the explosion. People clean the rubble of Beirut, barely alive, sentenced to strain, shards of glass puncture their sleep. Sweeping, weeping, organizing, they wonder, who is it that tried to kill me? Sweeping, weeping, organizing, they wonder, who is it that will try next? So what I was trying to do through this comic was to reflect on this constant narrative of resilience that we hear, right? Of Beirut being a phoenix that will rise again, of people being so resilient in Lebanon, they can bounce back, right? So I did this through the repetition of sweeping, weeping, organizing, right? This narrative of resilience, and what it means in this context where, who will try next? So the threat is still imminent, right? So there is still ammonium nitrate in the port. We still don't see accountability, or justice being served, right? And so when we are thinking about trauma, I think it's very important then to continue the conversation that Hala Kerbej also started in her interview with Al Jadid, and she said, in a context where the state is basically telling citizens, your lives don't matter, your bodies don't matter to me. I mean, what is then the responsibility of clinicians dealing with the context that is itself creating the harm, right? So maybe we can think together about, can we even think about the importance of individual therapy in such a context where it is the state itself that is causing all the harm to its own citizens? So maybe, Christelle, if you want to ask any questions.
That was very, very interesting, and really thank you for that. It was really inspiring, actually. So I have a couple of questions for you regarding this topic. So by using art as a form of healing from trauma, as you discussed, how effective do you think this practice is? Do you think that we would be repressing some of our feelings by expressing them in art?
So it's interesting, yesterday I was just watching this curation of stories done by Sahar Assaf. So they did this digital dramatic reading of stories by healthcare professionals at AUBMC during the Beirut explosion. So I think that the very act of telling those stories, especially when they are about trauma, is a very important step towards healing, right? So many people who do experience trauma, one of the things that happens is this disintegration, right? So because memory is affected, you often repress certain memories, right? Basically, in a nutshell, your narrative is not structured. Okay, there is this disintegration of the narrative. The events don't make sense in your head. Then that's why it's very important. That's why we talk in therapy. The therapy is very much based on narrative, right? So the very act of narrativizing your experience itself is a way of connecting back to it. What exactly did happen? What was my role? Where was I in this space? So yes, I think it's a very effective way of healing, right? And particularly when it comes to the medium of comics, I think it's very interesting. The thing we can talk more about the genre itself. Now, is it sufficient? No, right? So we can tell our stories all day long, and I don't think creativity is. I think that we're lacking, right? There's already been an online drama series, Beirut 07, that was published. People are already publishing books and studies about the Beirut explosion, and the point is, this is yet again another form of exhibiting resilience, right? So this is an activated reaction to trauma. And we don't lack that. We have that. We are all doing it somehow in one way or another. What we do still lack is the accountability, right? So and the safety. So again, we can learn, yoga and other body-based practices and put incense and meditate and what have you. But if we are still inhabiting or living in a country that will not give us the policies we need in order to live safely, then that does not make sense to me, because it becomes like patchwork, right? So just if you zoom out, and it's a systemic problem, right? So you have very high rates of child abuse in Lebanon, very high rates of anxiety, high rates of depression, suicidal ideation, especially when it comes to LGBT folks. People are dying of cancer because of CO2 emissions. And so literally everything about our context says no safety. If we create art in this context, yes, it helps us a lot in healing. Is it sufficient? Then obviously not.
So I wanted to know, what inspires you to make your comics? What is the process you go through in making them? Do you have a certain vision in mind at the beginning, or do you choose, why did you choose to make comics?
So first of all, I used to doodle, right? I never thought of my my doodling as something, a skill that I can kind of work on. And it was, I've said this in other talks. I was very inspired by people like Alison Bechdel and Le Petit Nicolas for me to share these. I think comics are great because, I mean, they're queer in their own way, right? They don't fit into several other fields. And that really spoke to me as like a medium, because it allows you to do all sorts of things, right? So you can integrate your text in visuals, you can have, you can create all sorts of decisions visually around composition, the pagination, the margins, etc., that allow you to send the message. I think, and that's why it has been used actually for political reasons, right? So for political satire, etc., because it's such an effective way, right? It's depicting one thing, scene, have a message. It's very concise, and I like that, right? To answer your question about the process, that differs. I think that most of the times I really rely on my own experiences to depict them, right? I have learned, especially after reading, Black feminist scholars who are also queer, that gave me kind of the strength to recognize my own experiences as important enough to be reflected on, because they are also shared experiences in their political experiences. So I rely a lot on what it is that I'm living in the moment in order to be able to bring that into my comics. And, sometimes I'll start with having an idea, and then I'll look around and I'll sketch, what I think that should look like. And sometimes, no, it's the opposite. I'll think about how I want it to look like, and then I'll see what kind of message do I want that to send. So it changes depending on the situation.
That's really lovely. So, knowing our homophobic society, you're actually very confident for posting your queer comics and just being yourself. What advice would you give for the LGBT community in Lebanon who are out or still in the closet? Do you think it's healthier for them to live abroad, just like you did?
Yeah. And I've mentioned this to you before. Like, I think, I get asked this a lot. What kind of advice would you give for queer folks? And I think that we receive a lot of advice, right? I think we get a lot of prescriptions around, how it is that we need to respond to certain situations, and I think that, it's important to shift the conversation. So I would ask, for example, what would, what could mental health professionals provide the LGBT community in Lebanon, right? Or what kind of policies would be needed for the sector to kind of be more inclusive? And if that's the question, then I don't have a direct answer, because we are still in these layers of crises, and I think it's very hard to right now, since we are so in it, to recognize how we should deal with it, and I don't have answers. In terms of therapists treating queer and trans clients within this context, I would just start by, making a lot of individual personal efforts to stand in their shoes. A lot of queer folks right now are confined within their families, and they don't have access, right, to those communities, other queer folks or communities with whom they can organize or be around, right? I've heard the sentence of, I feel like I'm the only queer I know. I've heard someone say this. So I think it's very important that they really put themselves in their shoes and understand that right now is a very special time for them, right? And that their experience with community and space and family is changing, actually. And I think therapists can be very inclusive in small things, like asking their clients what kind of pronouns they prefer, or not taking things for granted, right? Unfortunately, a lot of professionals still ask in Lebanon, and even from the best institutions, right? They still, or institutions that have some policies around harassment or orientation or identity, still ask clients like, are you married, instead of asking, are you sexually active? So I think that therapists today, regardless of their own orientation or identity, have to recognize that, things are changing, and if you want to be inclusive, then this comes into the small things. I've mentioned pronouns, but also it's important for them to reflect on what kind of objects are in their clinic or houses, and how do those objects make their clients feel. So if I come into someone's office and I'll see a cross, for example, or a picture of their family, or things like that, those objects and how we interact with them, they say a lot about the safety of the space. And so, yeah, I think it's important for therapists to be creating a space that says, everyone is welcome here, and this space will not recreate certain traumatic experiences that perhaps, I don't know, you might have had with religious services back at your school, for example, right? And then the rest will have to do with policy, honestly. Most hospitals and psychiatric units, inpatient units in Lebanon, for example, still require that the visitors only be family members. Oftentimes, for queer folks, what family means differs, right? And for queer folks also, usually, most of this abuse also comes from family. So what are you doing here, right? So, okay, you have a policy that says, we support the queer community. Okay, that's great and it's important. But also we must complement this with certain policies that do more flexibly think about families, that do more flexibly think about all sorts of practices, right? Sexual practices and other practices. So yeah, it's a conversation to be had. I definitely don't have all the answers.
Yeah, as you mentioned, I really think it's very important for therapists to make a safe space for their queer clients, and there should be so much improvement at the policy level. So
Yeah.
we can begin the Q&A session. She said, I think everyone in their life has experienced trouble expressing themselves. You've experienced a lot of obstacles in being able to express yourself and your identity. At what time and under which circumstances have you started feeling comfortable with who you are?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Self-portraiture, right? So obviously all my work is very much about the self, right? So myself is very much in there. And I think that self-portraiture specifically is a wonderful tool because we as, human beings in Lebanon, and especially when you're a teenager, you don't just find out who you are and present yourself to the world, right? It's a process. And it changes, right? Sexualities, identities are fluid, they change with time. So what self-portraiture does is give you an excellent tool of representing yourself. And what this action does visually is provide insights about how you present to the world, how you want to present to the world, and how you think that the world sees you. And I think this act for me on Beirut By Dyke was very helpful in giving me some cues. So just to give you some example, if you scroll down to the end of my page and you look at the beginnings of my, the very first posts that I did publish, I would present my gender in a very masculine way, right? Now, I didn't realize that until, months or years later, in fact. So the very fact that I am documenting how I see myself in a specific moment shares insights to me about how I'm presenting to society, how I want to present to society, and how I think that society will be reacting to me, right? So yeah, I think this process is very therapeutic in this way. Right? It's giving you access to certain parts of your brain that language sometimes does not, that you really are more used to resisting using language.
So, Jane asked, are you still writing poetry?
Yes, I am. I am. And I'll be sharing some stuff soon. It's just interesting. Poetry allows me to do certain things better than just prose, and I use it in very specific contexts. yeah, I won't tell you. Just wait and see. I am going to publish poem soon enough. It's basically an open letter that's also a poem. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting medium. So, you know, to be honest, so for me today, it is much more terrifying to imagine not being able to share so much of my experiences than actually the consequences of doing so. So when I did start the page, I was in a point in my life where I felt like, okay, these are things that I need to make public as a way of validating them also, because and as you can imagine, right, I have had to kind of struggle with mental issues before, and I did not have the space to actually express the pain that I was feeling for all sorts of reasons, ranging from the social to the familiar to the whatever. So when I did actually start representing these things, these embodied experiences and these microaggressions, that was very freeing for me and very validating. And the more I shared, the more I kind of got stuff off my chest, right? And now I cannot imagine living in any professional setting or social setting or whatever setting that actually would restrict me from doing that. So yeah, it's interesting. You know, does it discourage me when I get negative comments? Not at all. First of all, you would imagine that I get all sorts of negative things because of what the page is about, but actually it's 0.0001% of the messages I do get are actually negative. So on the contrary, I get so many amazing supportive messages from complete strangers, right? Who tell me how my work has affected their reality in certain ways, you know, or what they think of my work, or you know, what it means for them. You know, I get some stuff from Lebanon and stuff outside Lebanon, and it's so very validating and reinforcing and supporting, and it's amazing, right? So in that sense, it's funny the types of communities we can build online with people we don't even know. It's a very empowering process to be sharing knowledge, reflecting on our own experiences in such a form, if you will, right? The types of negative messages I do receive are most often around, you know, nudity or things like that. So I'll get some harassing messages, but that never, ever makes me question how important this is. Thank you so much. Really, this means so much. You have no clue. So music in my ears. Express away. It's so important.
Awesome.
I definitely agree. So someone is asking, who supported you through your journey?
Oh, that's a nice question. I'm actually very lucky to have had an extremely supportive, amazing partner.
We're receiving so much love on the chat.
Yay! That's awesome.
Agreeing and
Make
saying
sure
that
to
they
send
love
them the
you.
love back. Yeah.
And there's someone that's asking, is there a comic that made you, that you were terrified to post?
Oh. Yes. Okay, just give me a second to think about this. Because yes, there are many of them that that terrify me. And some of them I will draw them and I'll save them and I'll come back to them later and then think, okay, this has to be out. This has to be out. Yes. So for example, the very comic that we used for this poster was very difficult for me to draw, to write, post, publish. So if you'll see, I couldn't even answer most of the comments. It took me a while to actually come back to it. So that comic was a reflection on the difficulties of talking about trauma using narrative, right? So trauma, by definition, is something that that has to do with interruption. It's very much interruption and disruption. And so when you're trying to tell a story around trauma, that has to have some kind of resolution. It's a narrative arc, right? But then how do you tell the story around trauma? So something that you still haven't processed, something you do not have a resolution for. it is in these moments where I'm drawing something that, you know, I'm still processing. I know it's important to say, but I haven't wrapped my own head around it. This is when it gets very difficult for me. And I've said this in my talk with Sarah Murat at AUB, that sometimes, so this is the back and forth between the concept and the process. So sometimes I'll put a story out there and I haven't completely processed it, and that in itself is terrifying. At the same time, it is also part of the larger process of healing from all these you know, embodied experiences of trauma. So that was one comic that really terrified me. Yeah, I can't think of the rest. Sometimes, I mean, when I'm talking about family members, for example, it doesn't terrify me, but I do take it into consideration, right? If I'm telling a story that has to do with me, but it also relates to other people, it creates its own challenges. But creating a comic about family, such as the comic that you saw about ضرورة سمينا بمساويتك, is in itself very important because it's breaking with the traditions that we have around in Lebanon, which is you do not air your laundry in public, right? And that's one of the ways in which, especially one of the things that actually hurts queer and trans folks, right, is the inability to even express that which hurt them as a way of protecting that social group of which they are or were a part. So I think it's very important to own back this narrative, and the very fact of representing it is breaking with those norms that tell you whatever you experience in the private sphere, that's private, and you need to, you know, shut up about it and process it by yourself. Well, I'm saying, you know, no, it's a social problem, and therefore it's a political problem that needs to be.
Yeah, I can definitely agree. Someone's asking if your therapist follows your page.
Okay, so I have wondered a lot about that, and I think my therapist was actually kind enough to tell me that she very well respects my work, but will not follow me so as to give me private space, which I very well respected. So no, she does not follow my work, and if she did, I would be much more. Yeah, I know that is sweet, but yeah, if she did follow me, that I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing so much information about my own process.
That's definitely understandable. So, asking, almost all of your art is in black and white. What is your relationship with that?
Oh, hi, Mlochie. I love your work also. And that's a great question. So, okay, my relationship with black and white is very much linked to my own experience with depression, right? So, in the beginning, when I first started the page, I would love to use this black color as, and I use it in several places as this kind of liquid that goes into your brain, from your brain, and it oozes out of your body, and it's very engulfing. So I did not want to experiment with colors as a conscious decision because when I did create Beirut By Dyke, it was also a promise for myself that I would not use humor or laugh or say positive things if I did not feel like it. So it was very much a place for me to express all these negative emotions that I felt should have been repressed, right? Symptoms of anxiety, symptoms of depression, etc. And black and white give me an excellent way of doing that, right? Because it's morbid, it's very, yeah, it's just that, right? It's very much about negativity and that which is obscure and unknown, right? And scary. I started experimenting with colors, interestingly enough, after the Beirut explosion. So if you realize also, you go through, actually during the protests, when the protests did occur, and the government was using rubber bullets and such, right? So this is when I started experimenting with colors, and definitely after the Beirut explosion. And I think that does also reflect my own mental state, right? Of also getting better and healing and wanting to express things differently. So I loved creating worlds that I imagined that has all these colors and shades and shadows that actually gave a different meaning and brought the illustration to life, right? But since I'm also experimenting with my own process, as Mbukhi knows, that might change. So I don't know. I'm still playing around with stuff.
It's very interesting, actually. So
Thank you.
unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I would like to thank you again for joining us today and spreading your knowledge and inspiration onto us. And we would like to share the certificate of appreciation with you.
No, you guys are so cute.
Is it showing? Is it showing?
It is opening. Yes, that is so cute. Thank you so much. That means a lot.
You have a wonderful vision, and you should keep doing that. And good luck with everything.